Hello and hi. Tonight we can discuss 5 true creepy neighbors from Appalachian small towns horror stories. So before we go any further, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications because stories like this don't stay buried for long. Now, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Story 1. The man who never used his lights. I moved to that town because it was quiet and cheap, the kind of place that doesn't advertise itself, because the people who live there prefer it that way. The mountains folded in close around the valley, cutting the place off from anything that felt modern or hurried. There was one main road, a few side roads that twisted off into the trees, and houses scattered far enough apart that neighbors were more like landmarks than company. Folks waved when you passed, nodded if you met them at the post office or the gas station, but no one asked questions. That suited me fine. I was coming off a rough few years and wanted somewhere that didn't expect anything from me. The house I rented sat on a gravel road about 10 minutes outside town. It was old but solid, with a sagging porch and a yard that bled straight into the woods. My closest neighbor lived about a quarter mile down the road, far enough that I couldn't see his house through the trees, but close enough that his mailbox marked the edge of what felt like my little world. The landlord mentioned him once in passing when he handed me the keys. "Quiet fella," he said, "keeps to himself." That was all. The first week passed without much to note. I unpacked slowly, fixed a few loose boards on the porch, learned which floorboards creaked at night. The road stayed quiet after dark, just the occasional car heading toward town or back out into the hills. I slept better than I had in years. The kind of deep sleep you only get when there's nothing pulling at you. I noticed my neighbor's truck the second week. It was late, maybe close to midnight, when I heard the engine. Not loud. Just a low, steady growl coming up the road. I stepped onto the porch out of habit, expecting to see headlights sweeping through the trees. There were none. The truck moved through the darkness like it belonged there, its outline barely visible against the road. Windows down. No interior light. It passed my driveway slow and deliberate, tires crunching softly on gravel, and continued on toward town. I stood there longer than I meant to, listening until the sound faded completely. At first, I didn't think much of it. Some folks don't like using headlights on back roads. Bugs, maybe. Or he just knew the road well enough not to need them. Appalachia is full of little habits outsiders don't understand. Then I noticed it kept happening. Every night, around the same time, the truck would roll past my house. Sometimes earlier, sometimes later, but always after dark, always with the lights off. No porch light at his place either, I realized. I'd driven past his driveway during the day and noticed the house sat dark even then, curtains drawn, yard overgrown like it hadn't been touched in years. After a while, I started waiting for the sound without meaning to. I'd be washing dishes or reading on the couch when that low growl would drift in through the open window, and I'd pause, listening as it passed. There was something unsettling about how consistent it was. Like clockwork, but without any clear purpose. The first time he parked outside my house, I almost missed it. I'd stayed up later than usual, the house quiet except for the ticking of the old kitchen clock. Around 1 in the morning, I realized the road had gone silent. No insects, no wind, just a thick, waiting stillness. I got up to check the front door, more out of habit than fear, and that's when I saw the shape beyond the porch railing. His truck sat at the edge of my driveway, engine off, lights dark. I stood there staring at it, my reflection faint in the glass. I waited for the door to open, for him to step out, for anything that would explain why he was there. Nothing happened. I don't know how long I stood there. A minute, maybe 5. Eventually, the engine turned over, soft and controlled, and the truck rolled away, disappearing back down the road. I didn't sleep much that night. I told myself he'd probably pulled over to check something. Maybe thought he had a flat. Maybe needed to take a call. In a place like that, you learn to make excuses if you want to stay sane. But it kept happening. Not every night, just often enough that I couldn't convince myself it was coincidence. Sometimes he'd stop across from my driveway. Other times he'd park a little farther up the road, just within sight of the porch. Always dark. Always silent. He never stayed long, never more than a few minutes, but the waiting felt deliberate. Like he was timing something I couldn't see. I started locking my doors earlier. checking the windows twice before bed, leaving the porch light on, even though I didn't like how it drew insects. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I was sitting on the porch when I heard his truck coming from the direction of town. Same slow speed. Same lights, out approach. Instead of pulling into my driveway, he rolled past and continued on down the road. On impulse, I grabbed my keys and followed. I kept my distance, staying far enough back that my headlights wouldn't catch him. The road twisted through trees and dipped into hollows where the darkness felt heavier, like it pressed down on the hood of my car. His truck never sped up, never slowed. Just kept that steady, almost careful pace. He didn't go home. Instead, he turned down a side road I hadn't taken before, one that looped back toward town through a cluster of houses. He drove past the same few places, over and over, making the loop again and again. Sometimes he'd slow near a driveway. Sometimes he'd stop completely, engine idling, before moving on. It felt wrong to watch, like I was intruding on something private and old. After the third loop, I turned back. My stomach knotted with a sense of dread I couldn't name. The next morning, I asked about him. I was at the gas station when I brought it up, trying to sound casual as I paid for my coffee. "That older guy down my road," I said, "drives a dark truck. Doesn't use his headlights." The clerk's smile faded. She hesitated, then shook her head. "You sure you got the right road?" "I'm sure," I said. She didn't answer right away, just handed me my change and said, "Best not to worry about other folks' habits." That response followed me all day. A few days later, I tried again, this time with a man who lived closer to town, someone I'd chatted with a couple times. When I mentioned the truck, he went quiet, eyes flicking away. "He's been doing that a long time," he said finally. "How long?" I asked. He shrugged. "Since before the road was paved. Before some of those houses were even built." I laughed, thinking he was exaggerating. He didn't smile. "He ever bother anyone?" I asked. The man met my eyes then, expression tight. Not directly. That night, the truck parked closer than ever before. I was brushing my teeth when I noticed the shadow through the bathroom window. I turned off the tap and listened. The engine was off. The silence felt thick enough to choke on. I stepped into the living room and peered out through the curtain. The truck sat at the foot of my porch steps. I could make out a shape behind the wheel this time. Just a darker outline against the darker interior. He didn't move, didn't look up, just sat there. I backed away slowly and locked myself in the bedroom, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I stayed there until morning, flinching at every sound the house made. The scratches started showing up not long after. At first, they were easy to miss. Faint lines in the gravel near my driveway, shallow scuffs like someone had dragged something heavy across it. I told myself it was deer or raccoons. Then I found the footprints, bare feet pressed deep into the damp soil near my porch. The toes were spread wide, the heels heavy, like whoever made them wasn't used to wearing shoes. They led away from the house and disappeared into the woods. I didn't call the police. I don't know why. Maybe because I didn't think they'd take it seriously. Maybe because I already knew deep down that this wasn't something they'd want to deal with. The next time I saw him during the day was by accident. I was driving back from town when I noticed the truck pulled over near a bend in the road. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and for once, I could see him clearly. He was standing beside the truck, facing the woods, head tilted slightly like he was listening. He looked older than I'd expected. Thin, his clothes hung off him loosely, worn thin in places. His hair was gray and unkempt, and his beard was patchy, like it hadn't been trimmed in years. He didn't turn when I slowed. Didn't react at all. As I passed, he lifted his head just enough that I caught his eyes in the rearview mirror. They didn't follow me. They drifted, unfocused, scanning the trees like he was watching something I couldn't see. That night I heard the truck more than once. It passed my house, then came back, then passed again, each time slower than before, each time closer to the porch. Sometime after midnight, it stopped. I sat in the dark, listening, every muscle locked tight. Minutes passed, then longer. I told myself if he came onto the porch, I'd call for help. I'd do something. A soft sound came from outside. Not footsteps, not the creak of boards. Breathing, slow, controlled. Right outside my front door, I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I sat there until my chest burned and my eyes watered. Eventually, the sound faded. The truck drove away. I left the next morning. I didn't pack much. Just what I could throw into the car quickly. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just drove until the mountains opened up and the roads felt wider. The house sat empty after that. Months later, I heard it'd been sold cheap to someone else. I wonder how long it took them to notice the truck. How long before they started locking their doors early. Sometimes, late at night, when a car passes my place with its lights off, my stomach still tightens. And I think about that man driving his loops, checking his old markers, making sure everything is where it belongs. Some habits don't fade. They just wait for new people to move in. Story 2. The woman who fed the creek. I moved up into that hollow because it was cheap and because nobody else wanted it. The road narrowed into gravel about a mile before my driveway, and the trees leaned in close enough that branches scraped the sides of my truck. Cell service dropped off somewhere near the last cattle gate. The realtor said it was quiet. What she meant was that it was forgotten. There was one other house down there besides mine, sitting crooked on the far bend of the creek like it had grown tired of standing straight. That was where the woman lived. I never learned her name. Nobody I asked in town claimed to know it either, just referred to her as that woman by the water. She was already old when I arrived, or maybe just worn thin by years of damp air and solitude. Her house leaned toward the creek as if listening to it. Gray boards peeled bare, windows clouded over, no porch light, no visible power lines. At night it disappeared entirely, swallowed by shadow and the sound of moving water. The first evening I noticed her. I was unpacking boxes when I saw motion through the trees. She came down the narrow footpath from her house, carrying a metal bucket in both hands. It was dusk, that bruised purple hour where the forest holds its breath. She moved slowly, carefully, like the ground might give way beneath her feet. She stopped at the edge of the creek, tipped the bucket, and dumped its contents into the current. I couldn't see what fell out, only heard the hollow sound of metal emptying. Then she stood there, not praying, not watching the water closely, just standing until the light went. She did it every evening after that. Same time, same bucket, no matter the weather. Rain slicking the stones, fog so thick it swallowed the trees, even once when sleet crusted the banks white. She never acknowledged me when I waved, never looked my way. I told myself she was feeding animals, fish maybe, or throwing scraps to keep bears away from her house. That made sense. People up there did things their own way. But sometimes, when the wind was right, I caught a smell, not rot exactly, something older, wet and ironed with decay. I'd wrinkle my nose and remind myself creeks carry all sorts of things. Dead deer upstream, old trash, runoff from storms. It didn't mean anything. The creek itself ran fast and loud most of the year. Snowmelt from higher up kept it cold even in summer, and rainstorms turned it violent quick. I liked the sound at first. It filled the quiet, made sleeping easier. But as weeks passed, I began to notice changes. Little things. The waterline crept closer to my property with each hard rain, biting away at the bank. Smooth stones appeared overnight where there had been dirt. Twigs tangled in odd patterns, like they'd been placed there rather than washed up. After a heavy storm in early spring, the creek jumped its banks and flooded the low ground between our houses. By morning, the water had receded, leaving the earth slick and shining. I went out to assess the damage and found things scattered along the mud. Not trash, not branches. A single child's shoe, stiff with water and silt. A rusted pocket knife. A scrap of fabric tangled in roots, floral patterned, torn clean like it had been cut. None of it made sense. This wasn't a road. No kids played out there. No houses upstream close enough to explain it. I carried the shoe to the woman's place that morning. I don't know why. Something in me felt like it belonged to her somehow. She stood on her porch when I approached, bucket beside her feet, eyes pale and sharp in a face like dried bark. Up close she smelled like creek water and old smoke. I held up the shoe and asked if it was hers, or if she knew where it came from. She watched me for a long moment, eyes flicking toward the creek behind me, then back to my face. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and rough, like it hadn't been used in a while. "The creek remembers who's kind to it," she said. That was it. No explanation. No follow-up. She picked up her bucket and turned away, conversation done. I stood there longer than I should have, feeling foolish and unsettled, then left the shoe on her porch rail and walked home. That night I woke to voices. At first I thought I was dreaming. The sound was faint, woven into the rush of the creek. But as I lay there, heart thudding, I realized it wasn't just water. It was speech, low and indistinct, like people talking through a wall. I got out of bed and crept to the window. Moonlight silvered the trees and glinted off the water. The voices drifted up from the creek, wet and tired, rising and falling with the current. I couldn't make out words. Just the sound of effort, of breath pushed through damaged throats. I stood there until the cold crept into my feet, and the voices faded back into water. I didn't sleep much after that. The next few days were quiet enough that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Stress, isolation. But then the creek ran high again after another storm, and something new appeared along the bank. A dented thermos, a length of chain, and closer to my house than before. A shirt, heavy with mud, stretched half, buried in the silt like someone had tried to crawl out and failed. I stopped going near the water after that. The woman continued her routine, unfazed. Bucket. Dusk. Silence. Once, as I watched from my porch, I thought I saw movement in the creek that didn't match the current. A shape rising and sinking just beneath the surface. I blinked, and it was gone. The voices came more often after that. Always at night, always from the water. Sometimes they sounded closer, like they were right below my window, whispering up through the dark. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they laughed, sharp and sudden, then cut off as if drowned mid-sound. I started sleeping with the lights on, with a radio murmuring low, trying to fill the space. One night I woke to a knock on my door. It was late enough that the forest had gone still, the creek a constant roar in the background. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door a crack. The woman stood there, bucket in hand, eyes reflecting the beam like an animal's. Water dripped from the bottom of the bucket, dark and slow. "You're too close to it," she said. Her voice carried the same tired weight as the voices outside. I asked her what she meant. She shook her head, gaze sliding past me toward my house, my land, the creek beyond. "It's hungry when it runs high," she said. "Always has been." Before I could ask anything else, she turned and walked back down the path, disappearing into the dark. I stood there shaking, listening to the water surge and pound. The next flood came harder than the rest. Rain hammered the hollow for 2 days straight, the creek swelling until it swallowed the banks entirely. I watched from my window as water crept closer to my foundation, carrying debris and foam, and things I didn't want to look at too closely. When it finally receded, it left a trail of offerings behind. A boot, an old license plate, a photograph so waterlogged the faces were blurred into pale smears. And right at the edge of my yard, half buried in mud, a human hand. I didn't call the police. I don't know why. Maybe I knew deep down it wouldn't help. Instead, I went to the woman's house at dusk, heart pounding. Her porch was empty. The door hung open, creaking in the wind. Inside, the house smelled of damp earth and iron. Buckets lined the walls. Dozens of them. Some empty, some not. I didn't look inside them. Out back, the path to the creek was worn deep, the earth packed hard by years of bare feet. The woman stood at the water's edge, bucket tipped, watching the current pull whatever she'd brought away. I shouted at her, demanded she tell me what was happening. She didn't turn. "It gives back what it takes," she said. "Just not all at once." I told her there was a hand in my yard, that people would come looking. She finally looked at me then, eyes shining with something like sorrow. "It remembers," she repeated. "And it don't forget." That night the voices were right outside my window, clearer than ever. I heard my name among them, stretched thin and wet. Fingers pressed against the glass, leaving streaks like river slime. I fled before dawn, throwing what I could into my truck, and tearing up the road without looking back. Months later, after the hollow had faded into memory, I heard the creek flooded again, took the woman's house clean off its footings. They never found her body. Sometimes when it rains hard where I live now, I hear water moving and think of voices carried along with it. And I wonder how long kindness lasts when the thing you're feeding learns your name. Story 3. The family that never opened windows. I moved up into those hills because I wanted quiet. That was the reason I told everyone. Anyway, truth was, I wanted to disappear for a while, and there are places in Appalachia where disappearing feels not only possible, but expected. Folks mind their own business. Roads end without warning. Cell service fades out like a dying radio station. I bought a narrow little house at the bend of a gravel road, where the forest leaned in close on both sides. The kind of place where the trees creak and groan all night, like they're shifting their weight, listening. Across from me sat another house, bigger than mine, older, with sagging porch boards and a roof that dipped like a tired spine. Every window was covered. Thick curtains nailed shut from the inside. Even in July heat, they stayed closed. At first I assumed the place was empty. Plenty of houses up there were. People moved away, died, or just stopped coming back. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized that wasn't the case. Some nights, I'd see lights move behind those curtains. Not steady lights like lamps turned on and forgotten, but slow drifting glows that slid across walls and ceilings, sometimes disappearing for long stretches before reappearing in another room. There was never a porch light, never a television flicker, just that dull, amber movement, like someone carrying a lantern through rooms they didn't want seen. I never saw a car in the driveway. No tire tracks in the mud after rain. No footprints in the snow that winter except my own and the occasional deer. Still, the house felt occupied. Watching it gave me the same sensation I'd get standing near a sleeping animal, something alive but pretending not to be. Mail started piling up at their box. Circulars, envelopes with official-looking stamps, a few packages left leaning against the post. Weeks passed, the pile grew. Then one day the mailbox was just gone. Not knocked over or damaged, gone. Post still standing, cleanly cut near the ground. I figured maybe the owners finally came by, but the house never changed. Windows stayed shut. Curtains stayed drawn. The lights kept moving at night. The sounds came next. At first it was faint, something like wood dragging across wood, slow and deliberate. It happened late, usually between 2 and 3 in the morning. I'd be half asleep when I heard it through my open bedroom window. That deep scrape, pause, scrape that set my teeth on edge. It wasn't random. Whatever it was, it had weight, and it was being moved carefully, inch by inch. Sometimes it lasted for hours. Other times it stopped abruptly, like someone realized they were being listened to. I asked around about the house when I went down into town for supplies. The woman at the general store frowned when I mentioned it. Said she thought it had been empty for years. The older man pumping gas beside me overheard and told me people used to live there, but he hadn't seen anyone in a long time. When I pressed him, asked who they were, he shrugged and said folks kept to themselves up there. Always had. Then he told me I should do the same. That spring, a storm rolled in harder than anything I'd seen in years. Wind tore through the valley like it had a grudge. Trees snapped. Power went out before midnight. I watched from my front window as a massive oak across the road finally gave up and fell, crashing straight through the roof of that house. Shingles exploded. Dust billowed up. I waited, heart pounding, expecting to see doors fly open, people running out into the rain, shouting for help. Nothing happened. Not a single light flickered. No movement. The storm passed, leaving wreckage and silence behind it. The next morning, I crossed the road. I don't know why. Some part of me hoped I'd find the place empty after all, that I'd imagined everything. The oak had split the roof clean open. Rainwater dripped into the attic, but the front door was shut tight. I knocked. Called out. My voice sounded small and wrong in that clearing. No answer. I tried the door. Locked. I stepped onto the porch and noticed something that made my stomach twist. The windows were fogged from the inside, streaked with condensation, like the house was breathing. Weeks passed after that. No repairs. No insurance adjusters. No relatives. The tree stayed where it fell. The roof sagged worse. And then one evening, just before dusk, I saw them. Handprints, pressed hard against the glass from the inside. At first I counted 4, then 6, then realized there were far more, overlapping, smeared, some higher than others, as if people had been stacked or climbing over one another to reach the windows. All of them faced outward. Every window had them. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. The scraping sounds grew louder, more frequent. Sometimes there were others, soft thuds, faint whimpering noises that could have been wind, or could have been something else entirely. Once, I thought I heard a voice, hoarse and low, repeating the same word over and over, too muffled to understand. I started locking my doors, keeping my lights off. I stopped sitting on my porch. I stopped opening my windows. The smell came in summer, sweet and rotten at the same time, carried on warm air that crept through cracks no matter how hard I sealed my house. I knew that smell. Anyone who's lived out there does. Death. But no one came. No authorities. No animals scavenging. Just the smell and the quiet and those lights still moving at night. One night, close to midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, dragging steps crunching through gravel. They stopped at my porch. I held my breath, heart hammering so loud I was sure whoever stood out there could hear it. There was a soft knock. Polite. Almost gentle. I didn't answer. The knock came again, followed by a voice so thin and strained it barely sounded human. It asked if I had any food. I stayed frozen until morning. When I finally looked outside, there were muddy footprints leading from my porch back across the road. They stopped at the tree, fallen house, and vanished into the woods behind it. The front door stood open for the first time since I'd lived there. I left 2 days later, packed what I could fit in my truck, and drove until the mountains flattened out and the air felt different. I didn't report anything. I didn't tell anyone the full story. Even now, years later, I don't talk about it much. But sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up convinced I hear that scraping sound again, slow and careful, like something heavy being moved inch by inch in the dark. And I'll picture those handprints, pressed hard against the glass, too many of them, all waiting for someone to finally open a window. Story 4. The House That Watched Back. I found the listing on a corkboard at the feed store, thumbtacked between a flyer for a missing hound and an ad for firewood. Handwritten. Cheap. Too cheap. Small house, quiet hollow, utilities included. When I called the number, the woman on the other end didn't ask my name. She just said, "You'll want to see it before dark," and hung up. I took that as Appalachian hospitality in its own strange dialect and drove out anyway, following a gravel road that narrowed into ruts, and then into a long dirt ribbon that dipped into a bowl of trees. The house sat alone at the edge of a clearing like it had been placed there and forgotten. Gray boards, low roof, windows that reflected the woods more than the sky. I liked it immediately, which should have warned me. The woman met me at the door with keys already in hand. She told me the last tenant had left suddenly. That phrase landed with weight like it had been practiced. I asked what that meant. She shrugged and said, "He didn't come back," and then smiled in a way that made it sound almost funny. The lease was month-to-month cash. No background check. No references. She pointed out the well pump, the breaker box, the wood stove. She didn't step inside. When I asked about neighbors, she nodded toward a house uphill through the trees. "He keeps to himself," she said, and that was that. The first time I noticed the neighbor was the evening I moved in. I was unloading boxes from the back of my truck when I felt the weight of being watched. Not imagined. Not paranoia. A pressure between my shoulder blades that tightened until I turned. He was standing on his porch, hands on the railing, leaning forward like he was listening for something. He smiled when our eyes met. It wasn't unfriendly. It just didn't stop. No wave, no nod. Just a smile that stayed too long, stretching thin, eyes open wider than they needed to be. I raised a hand. He didn't move. After a moment, he stepped back into his doorway and disappeared. That night, the woods made their usual noises. Crickets. Frogs, the distant yip of something hunting. I slept light, waking every hour, convinced I'd heard footsteps on the porch or fingers brushing the window screen. In the morning, my phone buzzed with no signal, the time wrong by an hour. I chalked it up to poor reception in the known unreliability of technology out there. I made coffee on the stove and stood at the sink, watching steam fog the glass. When I wiped it away, the neighbor was there again on his porch, staring. He lifted a hand this time and called out, asking if I'd slept all right. It startled me because I hadn't told him my name, and he hadn't introduced himself. It startled me more because I hadn't slept all right, and I hadn't mentioned that either. I answered anyway, something non-committal. He nodded like I'd confirmed a theory. "House can be noisy first night," he said. "Takes a while to settle." I asked his name. He said it, but it slid off my memory as soon as it landed, like trying to hold water in my hands. He asked what time I worked, whether I drove into town or worked from home. Normal questions, framed normal. I answered some, deflected others. He watched my face closely as I spoke, like he was reading something behind my words. Over the next week, he became a constant, not present exactly but aware. He'd be on his porch when I came home, no matter the time. Early morning, late night, rain or shine. Always watching, always smiling. He'd comment on things I hadn't told him. "You've been restless," he'd say, when I had dark circles under my eyes. "Dreams been heavy." He knew when I'd skipped dinner. He knew when I'd stayed up late reading. He knew when I'd taken a sick day. He asked how the house was treating me, and the way he said it made my skin crawl, like the house had hands. I started keeping my curtains closed. It didn't help. I'd feel that pressure again, that sense of eyes on me, and when I'd glance toward the window, the fabric would be unmoving, the glass dark. Once, I found muddy footprints on my back porch that didn't match my boots. They pointed toward the door, stopped, and then turned away. I told myself it was a deer. I told myself a lot of things. The house had its own habits. The floors creaked in patterns that didn't line up with temperature changes. The pipes knocked at odd hours. The wind moved through the trees and made the siding sigh. None of it was unusual on its own. Together, it felt like living inside something that breathed. I'd wake at night convinced the walls were closer than they'd been before, the ceiling lower. I measured, once, in a fit of nerves. Everything was the same. I laughed at myself and then lay awake until dawn. The first power outage came on a Tuesday. A storm rolled in fast, black clouds piling over the ridge. The lights flickered and died, and the house went quiet in a way that made my ears ring. I lit candles and sat at the kitchen table, listening to rain hammer the roof. Through the window, I could see the neighbor's porch light glowing steady and bright. It annoyed me more than it should have. When the storm passed and the power came back, I noticed something else. One of my living room lamps was on. I knew I'd turned everything off when the lights went out. I told myself I'd forgotten. I started a list in my notebook of small things to keep track of myself. The neighbor asked me the next morning if I'd enjoyed the show. I asked what he meant. He nodded toward my windows. "House likes storms," he said. "Gets lively." I told him my power had gone out. He said, "Did it?" and smiled like he'd caught me in a lie. I drove into town after that and asked around about him. The folks at the diner exchanged looks. One of them said he'd always been there. Another said he'd bought the place cheap years back. No one could tell me what he did for a living. Keeps an eye on things. Someone joked, and it landed flat. My sleep got worse. I dreamed of standing in my living room, watching myself sleep on the couch, my own eyes open and unblinking. I'd wake with the sense that someone had just stepped out of the room. I set up my phone to record at night, propped on a shelf, the red light blinking. In the morning, the files were corrupted, static, audio with no sound. Once, there was a single frame at the end of my living room, lights on, empty. I deleted it and told myself technology didn't like the humidity. The neighbor started finishing my sentences. I'd say I was thinking about moving the couch, and he'd tell me where it would fit better. I'd mention a headache, and he'd ask if it started behind my eyes around 3 in the morning. He knew when I'd had bad dreams. He knew when I'd woken up screaming. He'd say it gently, like concern. "House can get into you," he'd say. "Don't mean no harm." I stopped answering his questions. He didn't seem to mind. He watched anyway. One afternoon, I came home early and found him standing in my yard, close to the house. He was staring at the siding, head tilted, listening. I asked him what he was doing. He looked surprised, like he'd forgotten I could see him. "It's been talking," he said. "You must have heard it." I told him to get off my property. He stepped back slowly, hands raised, smile fixed. "Don't want to upset it," he said, and retreated to his porch. That night, the house was louder than it had ever been. Not bangs or knocks. Subtle things. A whisper of movement inside the walls. The sound of fabric shifting when there was no draft. The sense of attention. I sat on the couch with all the lights on, heart pounding, telling myself fear feeds on itself. Around midnight, the power went out again. No storm this time. Just a clean cut. The darkness felt thick. I stood and froze. From across the yard, I could see my living room windows glowing warm and bright. Every light on. Lamps I hadn't touched. The overhead. The TV, a blue flicker. I stepped onto the porch, breath fogging, and looked toward the neighbor's house. He was standing there, exactly where he always stood, watching my windows. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, like something had finally worked. I shouted his name. It came out wrong, garbled. He didn't respond. I ran back inside, and the door stuck for a terrifying second before opening. The light snapped off as soon as I crossed the threshold. The house fell silent. I didn't sleep. I sat on the kitchen floor until dawn, back against the cabinets. When the sun came up, I packed a bag. I told myself I'd leave, just for a few days, clear my head. As I loaded the truck, the neighbor watched. He didn't smile this time. He looked almost sad. "You don't want to do that," he said. "House don't like being left." I ignored him and drove away. I stayed with a friend in town. The first night, I slept like the dead. The second, I dreamed of the house again, empty, lights on, waiting. I woke to a text from an unknown number. "It's restless." I blocked it. More came. "It's calling. You hear it, don't you?" I shut my phone off. In the morning, there were missed calls from the landline. My friend said no one had been on the porch. I didn't tell him why my hands were shaking. Against my better judgment, I went back. I told myself I needed to get the rest of my things, to end it clean. The house looked the same. Quiet, innocent. The neighbor wasn't on his porch. That scared me more than if he'd been there. Inside, everything was where I'd left it, except the notebook. It was open on the table, pages filled with writing I didn't recognize. My handwriting, but wrong. Looped and heavy, pressed deep into the paper. Notes about sleep cycles, about how the house responded to fear, about watching. I flipped through, heart racing. The last page read, "It's easier when you let it see." I heard the porch boards creak. The neighbor's voice drifted in through the open window. "You left it alone," he said. "That ain't kind." He stepped into the doorway without knocking. Up close, his eyes were bloodshot, rimmed red like he hadn't slept in weeks. "It needs someone," he said. "Needs watching." I told him to leave. He shook his head. "I've been doing it a long time," he said. "Gets heavy." He looked at me with something like relief. "House chose you." I don't remember everything that happened after that. I remember the lights flickering, the house humming like a live wire. I remember standing at the window, watching the neighbor walk back to his porch, shoulders lighter than I'd ever seen them. I remember sitting in the dark, feeling the walls lean in, feeling seen in a way that stripped me bare. When I came to myself, it was night, and I was on the porch, hands on the railing, watching my own living room windows glow. Someone moved inside. I smiled. It felt natural. I don't live there anymore. I don't watch houses. That's what I tell myself. But sometimes, when the power goes out where I am now, I'll see lights on in rooms I didn't turn on. I'll feel that pressure between my shoulder blades, that sense of being known, and I'll wonder if the house ever really let me go, or if it's just waiting for me to come back and take my place again, watching, nodding, until something finally works. Story 5. He dug at the property line. I moved up into those hills because I wanted quiet. That's what I told everyone anyway. After my wife passed, the noise of town felt cruel. Every sound reminded me of something missing, so I bought a weathered little place tucked against a long stretch of forest in eastern Kentucky, a cabin that leaned slightly downhill like it was tired of standing. The land came cheap because no one wanted it. The realtor said the soil was poor, the winters were rough, and the nearest hospital was almost an hour away. That all sounded perfect to me. I didn't need fertile ground or neighbors. I needed space where the silence didn't judge me. The first time I noticed my neighbor, it was mid-October. Leaves were turning the kind of dull gold you only see when summer dies reluctantly. I was stacking firewood when I heard metal striking stone, slow and steady. Not the careless noise of someone digging a hole, but something deliberate. I walked to the edge of my clearing and saw him down the slope, right where the tree line thickened. He was bent over with a shovel, working a narrow cut into the earth. The odd thing was how straight it was. Perfectly straight, like a surveyor's mark, running along the invisible line between our properties. I watched for a while. He dug about 2 feet down, then tamped the soil back in, smoothing it with his boot. Then he moved a few feet and did it again. Same depth, same care. No pile of dirt left behind. No plants going in. Just trench, fill, repeat. When the sun dipped low enough to turn the woods gray, he stopped, leaned on the shovel, and drove a wooden stake into the ground with a mallet. He tied a faded strip of orange cloth around it. Then he packed up and vanished into the trees without looking my way. The next afternoon he was back, same time, same pattern. Digging right along that same invisible border, I figured he was marking something for a fence or checking drainage. Country folks do strange but practical things all the time. I waved once. He didn't wave back. He didn't even look up. Just kept digging like I wasn't there. A few days later, I walked closer. The stakes had multiplied, spaced evenly every 10 feet or so, all with those little orange flags fluttering like tired birds. As I stepped nearer, he finally straightened up. He was older than I'd thought, face drawn tight over sharp cheekbones, eyes sunken and ringed dark like he hadn't slept right in years. His clothes were clean but worn thin, the kind of flannel that never quite loses the smell of smoke. "You don't want to cross those," he said before I could speak. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "I wasn't planning to," I said. "Just curious what you're doing." He looked at the line of stakes, then at the ground, like he was listening for something beneath us. "Keeping things where they belong," he said. I waited for more. He didn't offer it. "Well," I said, forcing a laugh, "whatever works." He nodded once. "It's important," he added. "Confuses things if you don't." That was the first time he used that word. Confuses. He went back to digging, conversation clearly over. I went home unsettled, but not scared. Not yet. The weeks passed and his routine never changed. Every afternoon, digging. Every evening, filling in. Never crossed the line. Never stopped early. Even when it rained, he wore a poncho and kept at it, the shovel making a wet, sucking sound as it went into the mud. Sometimes I'd see him kneel, pressing his ear to the ground like he was checking something before continuing. Then the ground on my side started to feel wrong. It began near the line, close enough that I noticed when mowing. The earth was softer there, springy underfoot. I figured it was moles or rot. But the soft spots spread, inching closer to the cabin over the next month. When I stepped on them, the ground dipped slightly, like there was empty space underneath. I tried filling one in with gravel, tamping it down hard. By the next morning, it had sunk again. At night, lying in bed, I started to hear it. A faint shifting sound beneath the floor, like dirt sliding slowly through fingers. At first I thought it was the house settling or roots moving. Old cabins make noise. But this was rhythmic, purposeful. Sometimes it sounded like scratching, slow and careful, directly below me. The first knock came in late November. I woke to it just after midnight. A dull thud, muffled by earth, not loud but insistent. Then another. 3 in a row, evenly spaced. I lay there, heart pounding, listening to the forest hold its breath. No wind, no animals. Just that sound coming from somewhere below the cabin, or maybe from the ground outside the foundation. The next day, I walked down to the property line, shaken and angry, ready to demand answers. He was already there, digging as always. I told him about the sinking ground, about the noises. He didn't look surprised. He just sighed and leaned on his shovel, rubbing his eyes. "It's starting to knock for you," he said. Not a question, a statement. "What the hell does that mean?" I asked. He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw something in his eyes that made my stomach drop. Exhaustion layered over fear, buried under stubborn resolve. "Means it's testing," he said. "Feeling where you are." "Who is it?" I demanded. "What are you digging for?" He shook his head slowly. "Not who," he said. "What?" "And I ain't digging for it. I'm keeping it from getting confused." I laughed, sharp and hollow. "You're saying there's something under my house?" "Under all of it," he said, tapping the shovel into the dirt. "Old runs, older than the deeds. They don't know lines unless you teach them." I took a step back, suddenly aware of how close my boots were to one of his stakes. "This isn't funny," I said. "I know," he replied quietly. "That's why I told you not to cross." I went home shaken, trying to rationalize. Old mines, maybe. This region was riddled with abandoned shafts. Sinkholes weren't unheard of. The knocking could be air shifting, animals, anything but what he was implying. I called the county office about old mine maps. They had records, but nothing showed beneath my land. They suggested a survey, but winter was coming, and the waitlist was long. The knocking got worse. It started happening every night, always around the same time. 3 knocks. Sometimes 4. Sometimes a scraping sound followed, like something dragging itself through tight spaces. I started sleeping in the living room, then not sleeping at all. I'd sit with a shotgun across my lap, staring at the floor, listening to the house breathe. One night I heard voices, not words, not exactly. More like breath pushed through throats that hadn't used language in a long time. Low murmurs, rising and falling beneath the boards. I pressed my ear to the floor, heart hammering, and felt vibration. Movement. Something passing directly under me. The next morning, I found footprints near the soft ground by the line. Bare feet, long toes splayed wide, pressed deep into the mud like whoever made them was heavier than they should have been. They stopped at the stakes, turned, went back the way they came. I confronted my neighbor again, voice shaking. "They're coming up," I said. "I saw the tracks." He nodded, as if I'd told him it was going to rain. "They're curious," he said. "They don't like when things change above them." "Who are they?" I asked. "People." He hesitated, and in that pause I felt something cold settle in my chest. "They were," he said finally. "Long time ago. Folks went missing up here back when the coal dried up. Whole families. People said they left. But some don't leave land. Some go into it." I stared at him, mind rebelling. "You're saying they live underground?" "They live where they fit," he said. "Tunnels collapse. New ones get dug. They follow the soft places." "Why you?" I asked. "Why are you dealing with this?" He smiled sadly. "Because my daddy didn't. And his daddy before him tried to ignore it." I learned. That night, the knocking came from the walls. I heard it behind the stove first, a dull impact followed by a shiver through the metal. Plaster dust sifted down like fine snow. Then another knock closer. I grabbed the shotgun and backed into the center of the room, breathing fast, sweat cold on my neck. The sounds moved, circling the cabin, testing. "Feeling?" Then I heard a voice, clear as day, right beneath the floorboards. Cold. It whispered. I don't remember screaming, but my throat burned afterward. I ran. I didn't grab anything. I burst out into the night, boots slipping in the mud, and sprinted downhill toward the property line. My neighbor was there, lantern lit, shovel in hand, like he'd been waiting. "They're confused," he said urgently. "You crossed last week." "I told you not to." "I never crossed." I yelled. "You stepped over a stake," he said. "Just once. That's all it takes." Behind us, the ground bulged, soil lifting as if something beneath was pushing up hard. The knocking turned frantic, rapid impacts shaking the earth. He started digging faster than I'd ever seen, carving a trench deeper, wider, sweat pouring off him. He shouted at me to hammer in stakes, to keep the line straight. I did what he said, hands shaking so bad I nearly missed. Something broke through near the cabin. I heard wood splinter. Heard that breathing again, louder now, eager. Shapes moved beneath the surface, fast and wrong, like fish under ice. When it stopped, it was sudden. The ground settled. The forest exhaled. My neighbor filled the trench in silence, tamping the earth down with shaking legs. Dawn crept in pale and sickly. My cabin was gone, not collapsed, not burned, just sunk. The roof visible at an angle, walls crushed inward like the land had swallowed it whole. There were handprints in the mud around the depression. Human, but stretched. Fingertips dragged deep grooves. I didn't ask to stay. I didn't ask for help. I packed what little I had left and left that day. The county called it a sinkhole. Insurance didn't cover it. They said I was lucky to be alive. Sometimes, late at night, in my new apartment far from those hills, I hear knocking in the pipes. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. And I remember his tired eyes, the stakes, the careful lines. I remember him saying I'd be thankful when it stopped knocking. It hasn't stopped. It's just learned where I am.